I still wake up some mornings thinking I can smell the whiskey and sawdust from Murphy's old saloon. 11 years have passed since Uncle Garrett walked through those swinging doors and never came back out. The building's been empty since the copper mine shut down, windows boarded up like closed eyes, but I can still see him clear as yesterday, tipping his worn felt hat to the bartender, that crooked smile playing at the corners of his mouth. My name is Samuel, and Garrett was my father's younger brother, though he carried himself like he'd seen more of the world than any of us. He had this way of making you feel like you were part of something bigger just by being in the same room. When Pa died in the mine collapse, Garrett stepped in without being asked. He taught me to rope cattle, to read the weather in the clouds, to fix a broken wagon wheel with nothing but determination and prairie ingenuity. The day he disappeared was unseasonably warm for October. I remember because the cottonwoods along Willow Creek were already turning gold, but the air still held summer's last breath. Garrett had been quieter than usual that week, spending long hours on the porch after supper, staring out at the horizon like he was waiting for something. Ma said he had the look of a man wrestling with his conscience. That morning, he helped me with the morning chores, same as always. We milked the cows, fed the chickens, checked the fence line where the coyotes had been testing our resolve. His hands were steady on the pitchfork, his voice calm when he told me about rotating the cattle to the north pasture. Nothing in his manner suggested this would be the last conversation we'd ever have. After breakfast, he announced he was riding into town for supplies. Said Murphy's might have news from the territorial capital, maybe word about when the mine might reopen. Ma packed him biscuits wrapped in brown paper, kissed his forehead like she always did. I watched from the kitchen window as he mounted his bay mare, Thunder, and rode toward the dusty main street that led to Murphy's saloon. The sun was high when Thunder came back without him. The mare stood by the water trough, reins dragging in the dirt, saddle still cinched tight. Her coat was dry, no sign of hard riding or struggle. She just stood there patient as stone, waiting for someone to notice what the rest of us were too slow to understand. My uncle was gone, and Thunder was the only witness who couldn't tell us what happened. We searched that saloon from floor to ceiling. Murphy himself was long gone by then, fled to California when the mine closed. The place was empty except for dust motes dancing in the afternoon light and the ghost of 1,000 conversations. Overturned chairs, empty bottles, a deck of cards scattered across a table like someone had left mid-hand. But no sign of Garrett. No blood, no struggle, no explanation. Sheriff Dawkins came out from the county seat, brought 2 deputies and a tracking dog. They found Garrett's boot prints in the dust outside Murphy's, clear as day leading up to the front door. Inside, the prints disappeared on the wooden floor, lost among years of accumulated footprints from miners and gamblers and traveling salesmen. The dog circled the building twice, whined once, then sat down in the shade like the scent had simply vanished into thin air. We posted notices in 3 counties, sent telegrams to every town within 100 miles, offered a reward we couldn't afford for any information about a man who stood 6 feet tall, had graying brown hair, and wore a black felt hat with a silver hatband. The responses trickled back over weeks. Nobody had seen him. Nobody knew anything. Nobody could explain how a man could walk into a building and disappear like smoke. Ma aged 10 years in those first few months. She'd stand at the kitchen window every evening around the time Garrett used to come home, her hand pressed against the glass like she could will him to appear on the horizon. I took over his responsibilities around the ranch, but I was 17 and unprepared for the weight of a man's work. The cattle knew the difference, the land knew the difference, and somewhere deep in my bones, I knew the difference too. Winter came early that year, and with it the understanding that searching was futile. The last leaves fell from the cottonwoods, snow covered Garrett's boot prints outside Murphy's, and life settled into the hollow rhythm of moving forward without him. We never spoke about what might have happened, but I know we all wondered, had he run away, been murdered? simply walked out into the prairie to start over somewhere else. The saloon stood empty through that winter and the next, a monument to unanswered questions. Sometimes I'd ride past and see the wind pushing tumbleweeds against the front door, like the prairie itself was trying to keep the building's secrets buried. The windows stared out blind and dark, and I learned to look away rather than wonder what they might have witnessed. Years passed, seasons turned, and gradually the sharp edge of grief wore smooth. Marie married a good man named Robert, who treated Garrett's memory with respect. I married my sweetheart Ellen, started a family of my own. Life moved forward the way life always does, carrying us along whether we're ready or not. But sometimes, in quiet moments, I still found myself wondering about that October day when my uncle walked into Murphy's saloon and never walked out. The building began to fall apart without maintenance. The roof leaked. Boards warped and split. The front steps sagged under the weight of neglect. Folks talked about tearing it down, but somehow nobody ever got around to it. Maybe we all sensed that destroying the last place anyone had seen Garrett would be like erasing him completely. So Murphy's stood there year after year, slowly returning to the dust from which it came. I thought I'd made peace with never knowing what happened. I thought time had healed the wound, or at least taught me to live with the scar. I was wrong, because 11 years after Uncle Garrett disappeared, they found his hat in the dust, and suddenly all those carefully buried questions came clawing their way back to the surface like prairie dogs after a long winter underground. Young Tom Bradley made the discovery on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Tom worked for the Territorial Surveyor's Office, mapping property lines for the railroad company that was eyeing our valley for a new route west. He'd been measuring and marking around the old commercial district when curiosity got the better of him. Murphy's saloon had been abandoned so long that most folks had stopped seeing it, the way you stop noticing a familiar scar. Tom later told me he'd been drawn by the sound of creaking wood. The winter had been harsh, with ice storms that brought down telegraph lines and split fence posts like kindling. The saloon's front door had finally surrendered to 11 years of weather, hanging crooked on rusted hinges that sang in the wind. Tom said it sounded almost like a voice calling out, though he laughed when he told me that part. He pushed the door open wider and stepped inside, boot heels echoing in the empty space. The afternoon sun slanted through gaps in the boarded windows, casting prison bar shadows across the warped floorboards. Mice had made nests in the corners, and spider webs draped the chandelier like funeral lace. The bar still stood against the far wall, its mirror cracked but not shattered, reflecting fragments of light and shadow. Tom was measuring the interior dimensions when he noticed something that didn't belong. In the far corner, where the shadows gathered thickest, sat a perfect circle of undisturbed dust. It was maybe 3 feet across, smooth as a still pond, while the rest of the floor showed the chaotic tracks of small animals and wind-blown debris. Something had been sitting there, protecting that spot, keeping it clean and untouched for years. And in the center of that circle, like a monument in a cemetery, sat Uncle Garrett's black felt hat. Tom knew it was Garrett's hat because everyone in the county remembered that silver hat band. Garrett had won it in a poker game from a traveling preacher who claimed it was blessed silver from a Mexican church. Whether that was true or not, the hat band caught light like water, distinctive enough that you could spot it from across a crowded room. Tom had seen Garrett wear it to church socials, cattle auctions, harvest dances. There was no mistaking it. The hat sat crown up, as if someone had carefully placed it there with ceremony and respect. The felt was weathered but intact, the silver hatband tarnished but unbroken. A thin layer of dust covered it, but not the thick coating you'd expect after 11 years. It looked like it had been placed there recently, maybe even that morning. Tom said his hands shook when he reached for it, half expecting it to crumble at his touch. He rode straight to our ranch, hat clutched against his chest like a baby bird. I was repairing harness in the barn when I heard hoofbeats coming fast up the drive. Ellen came out to see what the commotion was about, wiping flour from her hands on her apron. Our children, Mary and young Garrett, named for his missing great-uncle, peered around her skirts with wide, curious eyes. Tom dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his face pale as fresh snow. He held out the hat without saying a word, and the bottom dropped out of my world. I hadn't seen that silver hatband in 11 years, but I recognized it instantly. The way light danced across the tarnished surface, the small dent near the crown where Garrett had dropped it from the hayloft when he was 20. Every scratch and stain told a story I knew by heart. "Where?" was the only word I could manage. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, like it was coming from someone else's throat. Ellen's hand found my shoulder, her fingers gripping tight enough to anchor me to the present moment. The children sensed something momentous was happening, their chatter fading to respectful silence. Tom explained about the surveying work, about the creaking door and the perfect circle of undisturbed dust. His words came in a rush, tumbling over each other like rocks in an avalanche. He kept apologizing for touching the hat, for disturbing what might be evidence, for bringing us this reminder of old grief. But I wasn't listening to his apologies. I was turning the hat over in my hands, searching for clues in its worn fabric and familiar contours. The leather sweatband was cracked but still intact. Inside the crown, faded ink spelled out G. Morrison in Garrett's careful script. He'd written his name there the day he bought the hat, joking that he was getting so old he might forget who he was. The joke wasn't funny anymore. After 11 years, we'd all begun to forget pieces of him. The way his voice sounded when he laughed, the exact shade of his eyes, the rhythm of his walk. Ellen made coffee while Tom and I sat on the porch, the hat resting on the table between us like a conversation neither of us knew how to start. The late afternoon sun painted the mountains purple and gold, the same colors that had been there the day Garrett disappeared. Time moved in circles out here, seasons repeating endlessly, while human lives flickered like candle flames in the wind. It was sitting there like someone placed it yesterday, Tom said for the third time. Clean as Sunday morning, sitting right in the middle of that smooth dust. Don't make sense after all these years. Don't make sense at all. He shook his head and stared into his coffee cup like it might hold answers. I understood his confusion because I felt it too, a deep unease that had nothing to do with the supernatural and everything to do with the stubborn persistence of unanswered questions. That night, I lay awake listening to Ellen's steady breathing and staring at the ceiling. The hat sat on my dresser where I could see it in the moonlight, a dark silhouette against the whitewashed wall. 11 years of wondering, of building theories and discarding them, of learning to live with uncertainty. Now this piece of physical evidence had emerged from the shadows, demanding attention, insisting that the story wasn't over after all. I rode to Murphy's Saloon the next morning before dawn, needing to see the place where Tom had found the hat. The building looked smaller than I remembered, shrunken by neglect and weather. The crooked door gaped open like a wound, and tumbleweeds had gathered against the steps like mourners at a funeral. I tied my horse to the hitching post that still stood out front, worn smooth by countless hands, but sturdy as the day Murphy installed it. Stepping inside felt like walking into a tomb. The air was thick with dust and the sweet smell of decay, mouse droppings and dry rot, and the ghost of spilled whiskey. My boots echoed hollow on the warped floorboards, each step disturbing the perfect silence that had settled over this place like a shroud. Light filtered through the boarded windows in thin golden streams, illuminating dance halls of dust motes that swirled at my passing. I found the corner where Tom had discovered the hat, that perfect circle of smooth dust still visible in the weak morning light. The area was maybe 3 feet across, bordered by the chaotic tracks of mice and pack rats, but untouched within its boundaries. It looked like someone had been sweeping this one spot clean, while letting the rest of the building fall to ruin. But who? And why? Kneeling beside the circle, I ran my fingers along its edge where smooth dust met disturbed dirt. The boundary was precise, almost geometric in its perfection. This wasn't the result of natural settling or animal behavior. Someone had been maintaining this space, keeping it clear and clean through seasons of neglect. The thought sent cold fingers walking up my spine, despite the warming morning air. I searched the rest of the building with methodical care, looking for any other signs of recent presence. The bar held nothing but empty bottles and mouse nests. The gambling tables were thick with dust and bird droppings. In what used to be Murphy's office, I found a ledger book with pages scattered by wind and weather, the ink faded beyond reading. But nowhere else did I find any evidence of human attention or care. The more I examined that corner, the more convinced I became that someone had been visiting this place regularly. Not recently, the dust on the hat suggested it had been sitting there for months, but consistently over the years. Someone who knew about Garrett's disappearance, who felt compelled to maintain this strange shrine in an abandoned building. Someone with answers to questions that had been eating at our family for 11 years. I spent the morning walking the perimeter of the building, looking for signs of regular foot traffic. The ground was hard-packed dirt and gravel, not ideal for preserving tracks, but I found what might have been a faint path leading from the back of the saloon toward the creek. It could have been a game trail. Deer and elk used the creek for water, but it seemed to follow too straight a line, too purposeful a route. The trail, if that's what it was, led through scrub oak and wild roses to a shallow crossing where Willow Creek meandered between moss-covered stones. On the far side, the ground rose gradually toward a series of low hills dotted with pine and aspen. I'd hunted these hills as a boy with Garrett, chasing rabbits and prairie chickens through the undergrowth. He'd known every draw and ridge, every hidden spring and game trail. Standing there by the creek, I tried to imagine what might have happened that October day 11 years ago. Had Garrett left Murphy's by the back door? Had he met someone by the creek? Someone who'd been expecting him? The water gurgled over the stones with the same voice it had carried for centuries, indifferent to human mysteries and human pain. If these rocks could speak, what stories would they tell? I followed the possible trail up into the hills, pushing through brush that caught at my clothes and scratched my hands. The path, if it existed at all, was faint and broken, more suggestion than reality. But something drew me forward, a feeling I couldn't name that whispered I was moving in the right direction. Maybe it was just the desperate need to believe that answers were possible after so many years of questions. The hills grew steeper as I climbed, and the trail, real or imagined, seemed to fade among the rocks and deadfall. I found myself breathing hard, sweat sticking my shirt to my back despite the cool morning air. At 41, I wasn't the boy who'd scrambled through these hills with his uncle, chasing adventure and imagined treasures. Time had weight now, and grief had given it mass. I was about to turn back when I spotted something that made me stop and stare. Perhaps a quarter-mile ahead, tucked into a fold of the hillside where pine trees grew thick and dark, stood the ruins of an old cabin. I could see the collapsed roofline, the stone chimney still reaching toward the sky like a finger pointing at heaven. Smoke-blackened logs lay scattered around the foundation, telling the story of a fire that had happened years ago. The sight of those ruins hit me like a physical blow. I knew that cabin, knew it as well as I knew my own reflection. Garrett had brought me here when I was 12, told me it had belonged to an old trapper named McKinnon, who'd lived alone in these hills until a chimney fire took his home and probably his life. We'd poked through the ashes looking for treasure, found nothing but bent nails and broken pottery. But what I remembered most clearly was Garrett's voice as we'd stood in those ruins, his hand on my shoulder, his words serious in a way that had impressed my young mind. "Sometimes a man needs a place to go when the world gets too heavy," he'd said. "A place where he can think, where he can figure out what comes next." McKinnon had that here, at least for a while. Now, standing on the hillside 11 years after Garrett's disappearance, staring at those same ruins where he'd once shared his philosophy about the need for solitude, I felt the pieces of a puzzle beginning to shift and align. The hat in Murphy's, the maintained circle of dust, the faint trail leading from the saloon to the creek and up into these hills. What if Garrett's disappearance hadn't been mysterious at all? What if it had been deliberate? I made my way down to the cabin ruins with legs that felt unsteady as a newborn colt's. The structure had been modest even in its prime, maybe 2 rooms, a stone fireplace, a lean-to shed for storing wood and supplies. Now it was just scattered logs and memories. The forest slowly reclaiming what had once been carved from its embrace. Aspen saplings grew up through the collapsed roof, and wild roses had colonized the spaces where walls once stood. The stone chimney rose from the center of the destruction like a monument to impermanence. Its mortar was cracking, and several stones had fallen away, but the basic structure remained sound. I walked around it slowly, running my hands over the rough surfaces, trying to read the story told in smoke stains and weather damage. Near the base, partially hidden by fallen timber, I found something that made my breath catch in my throat. Carved into one of the foundation stones, almost invisible unless you knew where to look, were the initials G.M. and a date, October 15th, 1881. The day after Garrett had disappeared from Murphy's saloon. The carving was shallow, done with a knife or maybe a sharp stone, the kind of mark a man might make if he wanted to leave evidence of his presence without advertising it to casual observers. I sat down hard on a fallen log, the implications of this discovery washing over me like creek water in spring flood. Garrett had been here, not just once, during our childhood expedition, but again on the day he vanished. He'd carved his initials and the date, creating a record that had waited 11 years for someone to find it. But why? What had brought him to this lonely place, and where had he gone afterward? The afternoon sun slanted through the pine boughs, casting moving shadows across the ruins. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine Garrett here, alone, with whatever thoughts had driven him from the familiar comfort of Murphy's saloon to this isolated hillside. What had he been thinking about as he carved those initials? What decision had he been trying to make in the solitude he'd once told me every man needed? I began searching the ruins more systematically, moving fallen logs and clearing away years of accumulated pine needles and forest debris. Most of what I found was exactly what you'd expect: rusted nails, fragments of pottery, pieces of glass melted and twisted by fire. But tucked under a section of collapsed roof beam, protected from weather by the timber above it, I discovered something that made my hands shake as I pulled it free. It was a leather saddlebag, old and weathered but still intact, the kind Garrett always carried when he rode out to check on distant pastures or make trips to neighboring ranches. I recognized the distinctive pattern of wear on the flap, the small tear near the brass buckle where it had caught on a fence post years earlier. This was definitely his, but what was it doing here in the ruins of McKinnon's cabin? Inside the saddlebag, wrapped in oiled cloth that had kept out most of the moisture, I found a collection of items that told a story I was only beginning to understand. There was a small leather-bound journal, its pages filled with Garrett's careful handwriting, a folded letter with my mother's name written on the envelope in his distinctive script, a daguerreotype photograph of our family taken the Christmas before Pa died in the mine collapse. The journal's entries were dated, starting about a month before Garrett's disappearance and ending on October 15th, 1881. As I read through his words, written in the fading afternoon light among the ruins where he'd hidden them, I began to understand the weight that had been pressing down on my uncle's shoulders in those final weeks, the burden that had driven him to seek solitude in this remote place. The early entries spoke of financial troubles I'd known nothing about. The ranch was deeper in debt than any of us had realized. Taxes were overdue, and creditors were beginning to make threats. Garrett had been trying to solve these problems without worrying Ma or involving me, taking on extra work, selling personal possessions, even considering offers to buy portions of our land from developers and mining companies. But the financial pressures were only part of the story. As I read deeper into the journal, I discovered that Garrett had been receiving letters from someone named Catherine, a woman he'd known before coming to live with us after Pa's death. The letters, which he'd apparently been answering in secret, spoke of a life he'd left behind, promises he'd made and broken, a chance for happiness that required him to make an impossible choice. The final entry, dated October 15th, was written in a hand that shook with emotion. I cannot stay and watch this family lose everything because of my failures. I cannot leave and abandon them to face those failures alone. The choice is between two kinds of betrayal, and either one will destroy something precious. Perhaps the only honest thing is to remove myself from the equation entirely, to disappear so completely that my problems disappear with me. I read those words 3 times before their full meaning sank in. Garrett hadn't been murdered or kidnapped. He hadn't run away to start a new life elsewhere. He'd made the decision that too many good men make when they feel cornered by circumstances beyond their control. He'd chosen to step out of the world rather than continue being a burden to the people he loved. The letter addressed to Ma confirmed my growing understanding. In it, Garrett explained the debts, apologized for keeping them secret, and detailed plans he'd made to ensure the ranch would survive his absence. He'd signed over his share of the property to Ma, liquidated his few remaining assets to pay the most pressing creditors, and arranged for a buyer to purchase the south pasture at a price that would cover the outstanding taxes. But what struck me most forcefully, as I sat among those ruins, reading my uncle's final thoughts as the sun set behind the mountains, was the tone of his words. This wasn't the rambling of a man who'd lost his mind or given up hope. This was the careful planning of someone who'd found a way to solve problems that had seemed unsolvable, even if the solution required the ultimate sacrifice. The weight of understanding settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat. For 11 years, we'd wondered what had happened to Garrett, created elaborate theories about his disappearance, lived with the uncertainty of not knowing. Now I knew, and the knowledge was almost harder to bear than the mystery had been. He'd loved us enough to erase himself from our lives, believing that his absence would be easier for us to bear than his presence. I spent that night in the ruins of McKinnon's cabin, wrapped in my coat and staring up at stars that seemed close enough to touch through the broken roof beams. Sleep was impossible, with Garrett's journal burning in my hands like a live coal. Reading his words by starlight, I could almost hear his voice speaking across the years, explaining decisions that had seemed incomprehensible until now. The journal revealed that Garrett had been planning his disappearance for weeks, working out every detail with the methodical care he brought to breaking horses or building fence lines. He'd studied the schedules of traveling merchants, memorized the departure times of westbound trains, researched which routes would take him farthest from everything familiar. This wasn't a desperate flight from responsibility. It was a carefully orchestrated vanishing act. But as I read deeper into his planning, I began to understand that Garrett had never intended his disappearance to be permanent. The journal spoke of temporary exile, of staying away long enough for his creditors to lose interest and our family to establish financial stability without him. He'd planned to send word eventually, to let us know he was alive and safe. The problem was that good intentions and careful plans don't always survive contact with reality. The last several entries painted a picture of a man whose resolve was beginning to crumble. Despite his rational arguments for leaving, Garrett's love for our family kept pulling him back toward confession and connection. He wrote about watching me work in the barn, seeing the way Ma smiled when she thought nobody was looking, realizing that the people he was trying to protect might prefer struggle shared to safety purchased with abandonment. On October 14th, the day before he disappeared, Garrett had nearly changed his mind entirely. He'd started 3 different letters explaining the financial situation and asking for our help in facing it together, but each attempt had ended in crumpled paper and self-recrimination. The final entry before his disappearance was a single line: "Some choices become inevitable, not because they are right, but because they are the only ones a man can live with." As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I made my own choice about what to do with this knowledge. The truth was more complicated than I'd expected, neither completely tragic nor completely redemptive. Garrett had tried to be noble and had succeeded only in being human, flawed and loving and terribly, tragically wrong about what his family needed from him. I rode back to Murphy's Saloon in the early morning light, needing to see the place where this story had begun with fresh eyes. The building looked different now, less like a tomb and more like a way station, a place where journeys ended and began. I understood now why someone had been maintaining that perfect circle of dust around where the hat had sat. It had been Garrett himself, returning periodically to the last place anyone had seen him, unable to fully commit to his chosen exile. Inside the saloon, I knelt again beside the circle of smooth dust and tried to imagine my uncle here, alone with his conscience and his stubborn love for a family he believed he was protecting. How many times had he stood in this spot over the years, fighting the urge to walk out that front door and come home? How many nights had he spent staring at the boarded windows, listening to the wind sing through the empty rooms? The pattern of dust told its own story now that I knew how to read it. Not mysterious or supernatural, but heartbreakingly human. Garrett had been returning to Murphy's regularly, always through the back door to avoid being seen, always careful to disturb nothing except that one corner where he'd sit and remember and wrestle with the choice he'd made. The hat had been his final surrender to the impossibility of his situation. I found myself thinking about Catherine, the woman whose letters had offered Garrett a different kind of life. The journal suggested she'd been waiting for him somewhere in California, patient but not indefinitely so. Perhaps the hat left in Murphy's had been his way of closing that door as well, of acknowledging that some choices, once made, cannot be unmade, no matter how much time passes or how much pain they cause. The sun was fully up by the time I made my decision about what to do with what I'd learned. The truth was mine now, but it didn't have to be anyone else's burden. Ma had remarried and found happiness with Robert. My children knew Garrett only through stories that made him seem heroic and mysterious. Some truths were better kept private, not because they were shameful, but because they were too complex for simple telling. I took the hat from where I'd left it at home and returned it to its place in the corner of Murphy's Saloon. Not as a shrine to mystery, but as a monument to love that sometimes doesn't know how to express itself wisely. If Garrett was still alive somewhere, still wrestling with his conscience and his exile, at least he'd know that someone understood the choice he'd made, even if they couldn't approve of it. Before leaving, I carved my own initials next to his in the foundation stone at McKinnon's cabin, along with the date and the words, "Questions answered, love unchanged." If he ever returned to this place that had been his refuge and his prison, he'd know that his nephew had found the trail he'd tried so hard to hide, had followed it to its bitter end, and had chosen forgiveness over judgment. The saddlebag and its contents I buried beneath a cairn of stones beside the cabin ruins, marking the spot with a cross made from fallen timber. Some stories deserve to be preserved, even if they can't be shared. Future generations might find those artifacts someday and wonder about the man who'd lived so carefully and loved so imperfectly, who'd tried to solve everyone's problems by erasing himself from the equation. As I rode home through the morning sunlight, I carried with me the weight of understanding and the strange comfort of certainty. Uncle Garrett was gone, had been gone for 11 years, and would probably stay gone until the day he died in whatever distant place had become his home. But his love for us had been real, and his sacrifice, however misguided, had been genuine. That had to be enough. In a world full of unanswered questions and incomplete stories, knowing that someone had cared enough to disappear rather than cause pain was a kind of grace. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for when I began looking for answers, but it was the ending that made sense of everything that had come before. Ellen was waiting on the porch when I rode up to our house, her face creased with worry and her hands twisted in her apron. She'd known from the moment I'd left that morning that I was chasing something more dangerous than simple curiosity. 20 years of marriage had taught her to read the signs of a man wrestling with more than he could handle alone, and she'd spent the day preparing herself for whatever truth I might bring home. I told her everything, not because I wanted to share the burden, but because keeping Garrett's secret had nearly destroyed him, and I wouldn't make the same mistake. We sat on the porch as the afternoon shadows lengthened, and I read portions of his journal aloud, while she listened with the stillness that comes from understanding that words, once spoken, cannot be taken back. When I finished, she was quiet for so long I thought she might be angry with me for digging up graves better left undisturbed. "He was wrong," she said finally, her voice soft but certain. "And wrong about what we needed, wrong about what would help, wrong about love being a burden rather than a strength." She took the journal from my hands and held it carefully, as if it were made of spun glass rather than leather and paper. But he was wrong from the right place, if that makes sense. Wrong because he cared too much, not too little. That evening, we sat our children down and told them an edited version of the truth. Mary was 15, old enough to understand complexity, and young Garrett was 12, the same age I'd been when his namesake had brought me to McKinnon's cabin and talked about the need for solitude. They deserved to know that their great-uncle hadn't been taken from us by violence or accident, but by a choice that seemed logical to him and heartbreaking to everyone else. Young Garrett listened with the serious attention he brought to important subjects, his brow furrowed in concentration. When I finished explaining, he asked the question I'd been dreading. Will he ever come home? I wanted to say yes, wanted to offer hope and the possibility of reunion. Instead, I told him the truth as gently as I could. Some people who leave don't come back, not because they don't love us, but because they believe love sometimes requires distance. Mary cried, which surprised me because she'd never known Garrett as anything but a story and a mystery. But she was old enough to understand the tragedy of good intentions twisted into cruelty by pride and fear. She cried for the uncle she'd never meet, for the grandfather who'd died too young, for the grandmother who'd spent years wondering if her son was alive or dead. She cried for the way love can become a weight too heavy to carry. I made the decision that night to never tell Ma what I'd discovered. She was happy with Robert, settled into a life that had found its rhythm without Garrett's presence. The knowledge that he'd chosen to leave rather than being taken from us might bring her comfort, or it might bring her a different kind of pain. At 73, she'd earned the right to keep her illusions about the people she'd loved and lost. But I did ride over to her house the next Sunday after church, ostensibly to help Robert repair a section of fence line that had been damaged by winter storms. While we worked, I told Ma that I'd been thinking about Garrett lately, remembering the good times and the lessons he'd taught me. She smiled with the particular warmth reserved for beloved memories and told me stories I'd heard before, but never tired of hearing. "He had such a big heart," she said, handing me fence staples from the bucket she carried. "Sometimes I think it was too big for one person to manage. He felt everything so deeply: joy, sorrow, responsibility, love. It was beautiful and terrible at the same time." She paused in her work and looked out across the pasture where Garrett had once taught me to ride. "I hope wherever he is, he's found some peace with himself." I spent the following weeks settling back into the rhythm of my own life. but with a new understanding of how fragile the foundation of any life really is. Garrett's journal had revealed how close our own family had come to financial disaster without any of us realizing it. His careful planning and secret sacrifices had indeed protected us, though not in the way he'd intended. The knowledge made me more grateful for what we had and more careful about taking any of it for granted. Ellen and I began having conversations we'd never had before about money, about plans, about what we'd do if disaster struck our little ranch. Not fearful conversations, but practical ones, the kind that couples should have but often avoid, because they force you to acknowledge how quickly security can disappear. We made our own plans, shared our own worries, promised to face whatever came together rather than alone. The ranch prospered that year in ways that would have made Garrett proud. Our cattle were healthy, the market prices were good, and the new railroad line brought opportunities for selling beef to mining camps and growing towns across the territory. But more than the financial success, I treasured the knowledge that Ellen and I were building something together, sharing both the burdens and the rewards in the way Garrett had never learned to do. Sometimes, working in the fields or riding fence lines, I'd find myself talking to Garrett as if he were still there beside me. I'd tell him about his great-niece and great-nephew, about the changes coming to the valley, about the decisions Ellen and I were making together. I'd tell him that we understood what he'd tried to do, even if we wished he'd found another way to do it. These one-sided conversations brought me a kind of peace I hadn't expected. Young Garrett began asking more questions about his namesake as the months passed, and I found myself sharing memories I'd kept buried for years, how Uncle Garrett could gentle the wildest horse with patience and soft words, how he taught me to read the sky for weather signs and the grass for signs of good grazing, how he'd believed that every person deserved respect, whether they were rich ranchers or traveling preachers or women who worked in saloons. I told my son about the time Garrett had found me crying behind the barn after some boys in town had made fun of my patched clothes and homemade boots. Instead of telling me to fight or ignore them, he'd sat down beside me in the dirt and talked about the difference between a man's worth and a man's possessions. Character isn't something you can buy or inherit, he'd said. It's something you build one choice at a time, usually when nobody's watching. Mary often asked about the journal, whether Garrett had written anything about her grandmother or about the early days of the ranch. I shared the parts that seemed appropriate for a 15-year-old girl to hear, stories about family celebrations and shared work and the kind of everyday love that holds communities together. She was particularly interested in Catherine, the woman whose letters had offered Garrett a different life. "Do you think he loved her?" Mary asked one evening as we sat on the porch, watching fireflies dance among the cottonwood trees. The question caught me off guard, because I'd been wondering the same thing myself. The journal spoke of Catherine with warmth and regret, but not with the desperate passion of a man torn between two loves. More like the careful affection of someone who'd found companionship but not transformation. "I think he cared for her," I said finally. "But I think he loved us more, and that's what made his choice so hard. Sometimes loving people means staying with them no matter what. Sometimes it means leaving them for what you believe is their own good. Garrett chose wrong, but he chose from love." Mary nodded with the solemnity that came naturally to her, understanding things beyond her years the way some children do. The seasons turned, and slowly the sharp edge of discovery wore smooth. I still visited Murphy's saloon occasionally, drawn by reasons I couldn't entirely explain. The building continued its slow collapse, boards warping and separating, the roof developing new leaks with each passing storm. But that corner where Garrett had kept his vigil remained somehow protected, as if his presence had blessed the space with a strange kind of permanence. I never disturbed the hat again, leaving it in its place among the dust and shadows. It seemed important that it remain there, a monument to the complexity of human choice and the persistence of love, even when love makes mistakes. Someday the building would collapse entirely, or someone would tear it down for safety reasons, and the hat would be buried under rubble and time. But for now, it waited in the darkness, keeping faith with mysteries that couldn't be fully solved. Sometimes visitors to our valley would ask about the old saloon, intrigued by local stories of mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena. I'd tell them it was just an empty building, nothing supernatural or mysterious about it, just the ordinary kind of ruin that time creates when human purposes are abandoned. Most accepted this explanation and moved on to other curiosities. A few seemed disappointed by the mundane reality, preferring legends to truth. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become the keeper of a secret that was both more and less dramatic than the stories people told about Murphy's Saloon. No ghostly apparitions or supernatural forces, just a man who'd loved his family enough to destroy himself trying to protect them. In some ways, that human truth was more haunting than any ghost story could have been. 2 years passed after I found Garrett's journal. 2 years of carrying knowledge that sat heavy in my chest like undigested food. Ellen and I had grown closer through sharing the burden, but I could see the weight of it in her eyes sometimes, the way she'd look off toward the mountains with an expression I couldn't quite read. Secrets have their own gravity, pulling everything toward them, changing the shape of ordinary conversations and simple moments. The children adapted to the truth in the way children do, accepting complexity as another fact of adult life they'd have to navigate. Young Garrett started wearing his great-uncle's name with a different kind of pride, understanding now that he carried not just a family title, but a family story about the dangerous nobility of trying to love people more than they needed to be loved. Mary wrote about Uncle Garrett in her school compositions, crafting careful half-truths that honored his memory without revealing his secrets. I found myself watching other men in our community with new eyes, wondering who among them might be carrying similar burdens of mistaken sacrifice. Old Henrik, who'd lost his farm to drought and disappeared one spring morning, leaving behind a wife and 3 children who still wondered what had become of him. Jim Bradley, who'd told everyone he was heading to California for opportunities but had never sent word back home. How many missing men were actually hiding men, and how many families lived with mysteries that were really choices? The question haunted me because I'd begun to understand that Garrett's story wasn't unique or even unusual. Men of our generation had been raised to believe that strength meant silence, that protecting your family meant bearing your troubles alone, that love was something you demonstrated through sacrifice rather than communication. The frontier rewarded that kind of stoic independence, at least until it didn't, until the weight of unshared burdens became too much for any one person to carry. I started making different choices in my own life, small changes that Ellen noticed and appreciated. When the cattle prices dropped that fall and money got tight, I told her immediately instead of lying awake nights trying to solve the problem alone. When young Garrett broke his arm and the doctor's bill stretched our budget, we talked together about what expenses to cut rather than me secretly selling possessions to cover the cost. These conversations weren't easy, but they were honest, and honesty had become more important to me than comfort. The hardest part of carrying Garrett's secret was watching Ma age without the comfort of knowing what had happened to her son. She never complained about the uncertainty, never demanded answers we couldn't give, but I could see the questions in her eyes whenever his name came up in conversation. She'd developed the particular patience of women who've learned that some prayers get answered with silence, but patience and peace aren't the same thing. Robert was good to her, patient with her melancholy moods and gentle when she'd stare out the window at sunset as if expecting to see a familiar figure riding up the lane. He'd married a woman who came with a ghost, and he'd made room for that ghost in their life together without resentment or jealousy. But I wondered sometimes if Ma might have been happier with certainty, even painful certainty, than with the endless ambiguity of not knowing. The temptation to tell her grew stronger as she grew frailer. During a bout of fever that winter, she became delirious and called for Garrett repeatedly, begging him to come home, promising to forgive whatever had driven him away. Ellen and I took turns sitting with her, and I found myself holding her hand while she pleaded with shadows, wanting desperately to give her the peace that truth might bring. But when the fever broke and she recovered her clarity, I realized that the truth might not bring peace at all. Knowing that Garrett had chosen to leave rather than being taken from us might ease one kind of pain while creating another. The knowledge that her son had preferred exile to confession, had believed his problems were more important than her need to know he was safe. That knowledge might be a cruelty rather than a kindness. I talked to Ellen about it on one of those long winter nights when the wind howled around the house and the fire crackled in the hearth. She listened while I wrestled aloud with the question of whether truth was always better than uncertainty, whether Ma had the right to know, even if knowing might hurt her more than not knowing. Ellen's wisdom in these matters had always been clearer than mine. "Some truths are gifts," she said finally, her needlework steady in her lap despite the dim lamplight. "Some truths are weapons. The same truth can be either one, depending on how it's given and when and why. The question isn't whether Ma has a right to know. The question is whether you have a right to decide for her what she can handle knowing." That conversation stayed with me through the rest of the winter and into the spring, cycling through my thoughts like prayer or worry. Ellen was right that the choice wasn't mine to make, but practically speaking, I was the only one who could make it. The knowledge lived in my hands now, and whatever I did with it, sharing it or keeping it, would be my responsibility to bear. Spring brought other concerns that demanded attention. A late freeze damaged our apple trees, and a section of the north pasture fence needed complete rebuilding after being damaged by elk. The daily work of the ranch provided distraction from deeper questions, but couldn't make them disappear entirely. They followed me through the days like faithful dogs, always present even when ignored. Young Garrett turned 13 that spring, officially becoming a teenager with all the complications that implied. He'd grown tall over the winter, nearly as tall as I was, and his voice had begun the unpredictable journey toward manhood. Watching him change made me think about the uncle he'd never known, about the lessons Garrett might have taught him about becoming a man in a world that expected too much from men and forgave too little. I found myself having conversations with my son that I wished I could have had with Garrett before it was too late. Conversations about the difference between strength and stubbornness, about the courage required to ask for help, about the ways that pride could become a trap rather than a virtue. These talks were awkward and imperfect, but they were honest, and I hoped that honesty might plant seeds that would grow into wisdom. Mary was approaching 16, developing the kind of sharp intelligence that would take her far beyond our valley if she chose to go. She'd been corresponding with a teacher in Denver about opportunities for young women to attend college, something that would have been unthinkable in my generation, but seemed possible, even inevitable, in hers. Watching her plan for a future that stretched beyond everything I'd known made me proud and sad in equal measure. The world was changing around us, and our children would face choices and opportunities that Ellen and I could barely imagine. The railroad had brought new people and new ideas to our valley, and the territorial capital was full of talk about statehood and modernization. Young Garrett and Mary would come of age in a different world than the one that had shaped their parents and grandparents, a world where perhaps the old rules about suffering in silence might not apply. But human nature doesn't change as quickly as technology or politics, and I knew they'd still face the fundamental questions that had puzzled their great-uncle and puzzled me. How do you balance individual needs against family obligations? How do you distinguish between necessary sacrifice and destructive martyrdom? How do you love people without trying to control their lives or solve their problems for them? 5 years have passed since I found Uncle Garrett's hat in Murphy's saloon. 5 years of living with answers that raised more questions than they solved. The old building finally collapsed last winter under the weight of accumulated snow, taking with it the hat and the perfect circle of dust and the last physical evidence of Garrett's presence in our lives. Ellen and I rode out to see the ruins the day after the collapse, standing in the spring mud among scattered boards and broken glass. "It's finished now," Ellen said, and I knew she meant more than just the building. The mystery that had haunted our family for 16 years had finally been laid to rest, buried under the rubble of time and weather and the simple persistence of change. Whatever shrine Garrett had maintained in that corner was gone now, erased as completely as he'd tried to erase himself from our lives. Ma passed away peacefully in her sleep that same spring, holding Robert's hand and surrounded by children and grandchildren who loved her completely. Her last words were about seeing Pa again, about how handsome he'd looked the day they were married, about the apple pie she'd promised to bake him when they were reunited. She never mentioned Garrett in those final hours, and I chose to believe that meant she'd found peace with the questions that couldn't be answered. I spoke at her funeral about the strength she'd shown in raising children and managing a ranch after Pa's death, about the grace she'd demonstrated in accepting help when help was needed and offering comfort when comfort was required. I talked about her faith in the essential goodness of people, even when those people disappointed her or disappeared from her life without explanation. I didn't mention the secret I'd carried for her sake, but I hoped she'd somehow known that love had motivated both the keeping and the telling of difficult truths. Robert stayed on at the old homestead for a few months after Ma's funeral, but the house felt too big and too quiet for one elderly man. Eventually he moved to town, renting a room near the church where he could walk to services and socials without depending on anyone for transportation. We helped him pack Ma's belongings, dividing her few treasures among the family members who would cherish them most. In Ma's bedroom, wrapped in tissue paper and stored in the bottom drawer of her dresser, Ellen found a collection of letters that Garrett had sent home during the first few years after he'd started working for our family. They were tender, funny letters full of observations about ranch life and gentle teasing about Ma's tendency to worry over every small decision. Reading them, I could hear his voice again, could remember the easy laugh and quick wit that had made him such good company. The last letter in the collection was different from the others, written in the careful script of someone who'd given considerable thought to his words. It was dated just 2 weeks before his disappearance, though it bore no postmark and had clearly never been mailed. Instead, Ma had apparently found it among his belongings after he vanished, had kept it private for 16 years without ever mentioning its existence to anyone else. In that final letter, Garrett had tried to explain the financial pressures that were weighing on him, the difficult choices he was facing, the fear that his problems might destroy the family he'd grown to love as his own. But the tone was different from the desperate isolation of the journal I'd found at McKinnon's cabin. This letter spoke of trust, of faith in our ability to face difficulties together, of his intention to confess everything and ask for our help in finding solutions. I've been carrying these worries alone because I thought that was what strength looked like, he'd written. But I'm beginning to understand that real strength might mean having the courage to admit when you're overwhelmed, to ask for help before you're drowning rather than after. This family has shown me what love looks like when it's shared rather than hoarded, and I want to be worthy of that love. The letter ended with a promise to talk to Ma the next Sunday after church, to lay out all his concerns and trust in her wisdom and the family's resilience to find a way forward together. But that conversation had never happened, because something between writing the letter and Sunday morning had changed his mind, had convinced him that disappearing was a better solution than confessing. Finding that letter was like discovering a parallel universe where different choices had led to different outcomes. In the world described by that unmailed letter, Garrett would have stayed, would have shared his burdens, would have learned that families are stronger than the sum of their individual weaknesses. But between intention and action had fallen the shadow of pride, fear, and the terrible arithmetic of love that tries to calculate its own value. Young Garrett is 19 now, a man by any measure, though I still see the boy in his laugh and in the way he furrows his brow when he's thinking hard about something. He's decided to stay on the ranch rather than seeking his fortune in the wider world, content with the life we've built here in the shadow of the mountains. Sometimes I catch him staring off toward McKinnon's cabin, and I wonder if he's thinking about the great uncle who chose a different path. Mary did go to Denver for college, the first woman in our family to receive a formal education beyond what the local schoolhouse could provide. She writes letters full of excitement about her studies and her plans to become a teacher, maybe even to start a school for girls in one of the growing towns along the railroad line. Her letters remind me of Garrett's early correspondence with Ma, full of hope and humor and the particular confidence that comes from knowing you're loved unconditionally. Ellen and I are grandparents now, a development that still surprises me when I wake up in the morning and remember how much time has passed since we were young ourselves. Mary's oldest daughter has Garrett's grey eyes and his gift for gentling horses, while young Garrett's son shows signs of inheriting his namesake's thoughtful nature and tendency to carry the world's weight on his shoulders. I find myself watching that grandson with particular attention, ready to intervene if I see signs of the isolation that claimed his great-great-uncle. The patterns that run through families can be broken, but it takes conscious effort and willingness to recognize them before they repeat themselves. I tell him stories about sharing burdens, about the strength that comes from admitting weakness, about the difference between noble sacrifice and destructive pride. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the work is done and the family is gathered around our table, I think about Garrett and wonder where he might be, whether he's still alive, whether he ever found peace with the choice he made. The man described in that final unmailed letter might have built a good life somewhere, might have learned from his mistakes and found ways to love without destroying himself in the process. But I've stopped hoping he'll come home. Too much time has passed. Too many opportunities for reunion have been missed. Too many people who loved him have died without the comfort of seeing him again. If he's alive, he's chosen to stay gone. And at some point, you have to respect even the choices you can't understand or approve. The valley continues to change around us, new people arriving on every train, new businesses opening in town, new ideas about how life should be lived. But the essential questions remain the same. How do you love people without controlling them? How do you protect family without destroying yourself? How do you balance individual needs against collective responsibilities? These are the questions each generation has to answer for itself, and I suspect they'll still be wrestling with them long after Ellen and I are gone. What I know now that I didn't know 16 years ago is that there are no perfect answers to those questions. Only choices made with incomplete information and imperfect wisdom. Garrett made his choice based on what he believed was best for everyone involved. I made my choice about what to do with the knowledge of his choice. Our children will make their own choices about how to carry forward the lessons we've tried to teach them. The mountains haven't changed, still standing patient and eternal above our small human dramas. The creek still runs cold and clear, indifferent to our sorrows and celebrations. The prairie grass grows and dies and grows again, following rhythms older than memory. In the context of such permanence, our individual stories seem both infinitely important and utterly insignificant, which might be the most honest perspective of all. Uncle Garrett disappeared 16 years ago, walking into Murphy's saloon and never walking out. But in the larger sense, he never disappeared at all. He lives on in the lessons he taught us, in the love he demonstrated even when that love was imperfect, in the questions his choices raised about what we owe each other and ourselves. His story became part of our story, and our story will become part of our children's stories, and the circle will continue unbroken even when the individual links are forgotten. That's the real secret of the abandoned saloon, the truth that took me 16 years to understand. It was never about mystery or disappearance or the dramatic gestures that people remember in legends. It was about the ordinary difficulty of being human, of loving imperfectly, of making choices that seem necessary at the time but impossible to explain later. It was about the weight that some people carry and the ways that weight can either strengthen or crush the people who try to bear it alone. Murphy's Saloon is gone now, collapsed into kindling and memories, but the story it held continues, passed down through generations of people who understand that love sometimes makes terrible choices, and that understanding those choices is the beginning of forgiveness. In the end, that might be the only secret worth keeping and the only truth worth sharing.
If you like this story, leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next stories.